Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Griffith, and I work at the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. People should be seeing my screen, which is the NMOA website. We have a very ancient technology website. And Carla, you'll let me know if you can't see it. Do you see it?
I do.
Okay. Great. So I just am showing this so folks can know what NMOA is. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan interstate association. We are the 6 New England states plus New York and New Jersey. So basically the EPA Region 1 and Region 2 states and the waste programs in those states. So that's solid waste, hazardous waste, pollution prevention and toxic use reduction, but also the waste site cleanup programs. So as all of you know, PFAS has been a huge topic in the waste site cleanup programs here in the Northeast since about 2016 it emerged. So that's like 4 years now. And one of the things that NMOA does for the states is organized training and information sharing. So that's what we're doing today. I'm also showing this to show you where afterwards the presentations will be posted and you'll be able to find them. So down here you go to waste site cleanup and then you pick events. And then here's all our upcoming events. So we've got some more PFAS webinars coming up. I can tell you today that we're going to be having 2 more that were not in the email I sent out before. On July 8th, New Hampshire and New Jersey are going to be presenting about some of their investigations in New Hampshire, sort of their broad. They've been having the waste site cleanup program sites do sampling for PFAS for several years now, so they have a lot of data and they're looking at trends. And then New Jersey has been doing some forensics and source tracing in an area of New Jersey. They'll be presenting on those. That'll be July 8th. And then another one that I don't have the web page made for yet, but it's going to be on field sampling and cross-contamination, and we're going to have a presentation from New Hampshire DES talking about lessons learned in the field. And then Jim Occolini from Alpha Analytical will be presenting on the laboratory work that he's done trying to figure out field equipment that's used and what has the potential to have PFAS in it, so creating a cross-contamination. That one is going to be on Tuesday, June 23rd. So I'll be sending out an email that you should get with those, but those will be coming up. They'll be the same. There will be a fee for the consulting community, and it'll be free for government. So once you get to this website, the events, here's the past events, and there's lots of them. You can go and look at any of these. All the presentations are posted. See, I'll try to find one. Here's PFAS case studies with wider implications. So it has a summary of it. This is one we did last year. Copy of the presentation. State of Maine didn't want theirs posted, but you have the contact information. So each one of the past events, you can click on it and get the presentation. So just wanted to make everybody aware of that resource. So today we have a lot of people joining us, so we will not be doing questions verbally. You can type in questions at any point in the control panel in the questions section. So please do that. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentation. We're going to do a presentation from state of Maine first, then we'll have a few questions, then we'll do the presentation from Vermont, and then we'll wrap up with questions. So we are focused today on biosolids and some investigatory work that's been happening with those and the findings. 2 other webinars will also have a biosolids component, so I'll just let you guys know. This one about understanding fate and transport coming up next week on June 4th. They are the Arcadis folks did a report, and it was looking at land-applied residuals and biosolids. So even though it's mostly focused on fate and transport, it has a biosolids focus, and then also the one about field sampling and cross-contamination. The field sampling is more about biosolids sampling. So, so just a note on that. That will be June 23rd. So with that, I will turn it over to Carla Hopkins for the first presentation. Carla has worked for the state of Maine for more than 25 years in a variety of roles. Since 2006, she's been the manager for the newly named Residuals Management Unit, where she has been ever since, overseeing staff in all 4 of their regional offices. So Carla, I think you have to accept. There we go. Since March of 2019, Carla has been extensively involved in the PFAS issue. Carla and her unit, along with other DEEP EP staff, have spent a large amount of time in 2019 conducting a deep dive into DEP's paper records to provide data on all licensed sludge and bioash application sites and spreading records to determine where residuals may have been applied since the inception of that program. And that's what she's going to talk to us about today. Carla has a bachelor's in biology from the University of Southern Maine. So with that, welcome, Carla. And just a reminder to folks, we will be posting this presentation within the next day or two. And please type your questions at any point into the question box. With that, Carla, take over.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. I hope everyone is healthy and well out there and managing through these trying times. So Maine came to the PFAS table, and I'm having some technical difficulty advancing my slide. There we go. Sorry about that. So we came to this kind of sideways. You know, Maine had been doing some investigations at former military installations. We didn't really have an industry here in Maine that had used PFAS in its manufacturing. So we're a little bit different than Vermont and New Hampshire that way. And Maine was updating its remedial action guidelines, and they did have levels, cleanup levels for some PFAS compounds, PFBS, PFOA, and PFOS. And when we updated our beneficial use rules, our agronomic utilization rules point to an appendix in this beneficial use rule that draw from our remedial action guidelines. And so when we were updating those rules, we did include 3 PFAS compounds, PFBS, PFOA, and PFOS, with screening concentrations so that there were numbers in there. At that time, we had no plans to require residual testing, residuals being Class B biosolids or Class A biosolids compost at that time. The numbers were developed using the most conservative pathway with an endpoint, and it's important to note that this endpoint is 200 parts per trillion in groundwater. So this was leaching to groundwater. So those regulations were developed. At the same time, or just previous to that, and while those rules were being developed, we became aware of a dairy farm in southern Maine that appeared to be showing impacts from PFAS. And that particular dairy farm had received residuals in the form of paper mill sludge and bioash, or ash from burning of paper mill sludge, in the early to mid 80s. They were also licensed to accept biosolids as early as 1986, and they did receive and utilize those materials until about 2004. We became involved in this site in 2017 because of levels of PFAS in the milk that was being produced by these dairy cows at this farm. We tested many things, among them soil, drinking water, groundwater, milk, surface water, hay, manure, and purchased feed for the farm. And those numbers, I've just listed here the highest hit we had for each of these matrices. And as you can see, there appears to be some impacts. So it appeared at that time that it could be due to the residual land application that went on at the farm in the 80s to the early 2000s. Kind of at the same time and in the background, the governor of the state of Maine formed PFAS or signed an executive order forming a PFAS task force here in Maine. They had several purposes. One, identify the extent of PFAS exposure for people in Maine, the risks of PFAS to residents and the environment here in Maine, and they were supposed to then recommend approaches to address that risk. The panel of experts included people from the public health sector, our Department of Health and Human Services in the form of our drinking water program here in Maine, DEP officials, agriculture officials, folks from our emergency management agency, because of the firefighting angle, the AFFF foam angle. It had industry experts, Biosolids composter was on the panel, as well as a consultant and another facility that composts biosolids. And someone from the drinking water sector was also there. They held 8 meetings from May through December of 2019. So at the same time, in March of 2019, when this executive order was signed, a decision was made to require residuals producers who either land applied Class B material or produce Class A, either pellets or compost derived from biosolids, that we would be requiring testing for these 3 PFAS compounds that we developed screening concentrations for. The screening concentrations were, so for PFBS, it was 1,900 nanograms per gram. For PFOA, 2.5 nanograms per gram, and for PFAS, 5.2 nanograms per gram. So for these 3 PFAS compounds, licensees were required to do some testing. They had to also update their sampling plan because, as we know, we're looking at these analytes at very low levels, and there can be an issue with cross-contamination. So we did require them to update their sampling plan with those considerations in mind, send those to us for review and approval, and then they were required to do sampling in May of 2019. We also then turned toward the paper mill side of things, and we did require residual testing on their end as well. In May, an updated sampling plan was required, and then in June, we needed to see some sampling and then data from that sector, as well as from the wastewater treatment plant sector. And an important thing to say is, and this caused a lot of consternation among our licensees with good reason. It caused a bit of a panic, and for that I feel terrible about that. But it was required that they not land apply any Class B materials, any Class A materials, or distribute compost until approved by the DEP after we had a chance to review the data that was coming in on those residuals. At the time, 73 facilities were notified of the requirement to test. That included different types of facilities. We had 23 composting facilities. We had 41 land application program licensees. It's important to note that not all of the program license holders choose to land apply, but they do hold that license, so they were required to do the testing. And it also included 9 different paper mill materials. Some of these folks didn't test for various reasons. They perhaps weren't producing that residual at that time. They were out of business, but the license was still hanging out there, et cetera. So if the materials were over the screening concentrations that I outlined earlier, the licensees were then required to take a few steps. One was to perform pollutant loading rate calculations. And then if they were a Class A material, a Class B biosolid material, they were required to do some site-specific soil testing prior to being allowed to continue land application. And the reason for that is many of these licensed sites in Maine have been used for decades. Some of them were licensed, as early as the 80s. So we know that these materials, these PFAS materials, do not break down well in the environment. So we had a concern that they were built up in the soil already. To date, we've gotten data from 52 different sludges. And I say sludge because they are tested prior to any treatment to Class A or Class B standards. So 52 sludges. And we did get some data from facilities that weren't required to test that just happened to send the data in. So that was good. We got more than we bargained for. And it also included 3 heat-dried pellet products that are produced outside the state of Maine. We also included 17 composting facilities. As you can see here, they compost a variety of different things. Some are straight wastewater treatment plant sludge. Others are a mixture of wastewater treatment plant sludge and dewatered septage. In Maine, we consider dewatered septage to be sludge, so they were also required to do this testing program. And some do only residential septage for composting. We had 8 different paper mill residual data points, and to date we have also 86 site-specific soil data points.
Carla, this is just, sorry to butt in here, but there is a basic question that some people on the webinar don't know, the sort of Class A, Class B sludge. If you could just take a step back and let people know what those are. And
Sure. So those have to do with pathogen reduction and vector attraction reduction standards. So when a material is treated to a Class A pathogen and vector attraction reduction standard, it should not contain pathogens higher than what you might see in a background soil material. Class B is a little bit different than that in that it's not treated to quite that level. It has had some pathogen reduction, and generally in Maine, the way that pathogen reduction and vector attraction reduction is achieved is through liming of the material or through anaerobic digestion of the material. So they are treated to a Class B standard. So there are more restrictions on where materials can be land applied if they're Class B. Obviously, there can be more of a risk from pathogens for Class B materials, whereas Class A compost, that's treated by time and temperature to kill pathogens. So the compost has to reach specific temperatures for a specific amount of time in order to achieve that Class A standard. And in Maine, Class A compost can be distributed anywhere. We don't require site-specific licensing for Class A materials, but we do for Class B. Jennifer, does that answer the question?
That was great. Thank you very much.
Okay. So this is a graphic. It just shows you where the testing program has taken place in Maine. It stretches from, all the way to the northern part of the state, all the way to the south, and east to west. so it affected many facilities here in Maine. This is a graphic of our PFOA sludge data. And it felt important for me to break it down by analyte. We didn't see that PFBS was an issue, so I'm not going to go into the PFBS data. In many cases, in fact, we saw that as a non-detect number in many of the samples. So I'm focusing specifically on PFOA and PFAS here. You can see the blue line. Here is the median concentration we saw in sludge, and the green is our screening concentration. And many of the materials did exceed the screening concentration. Some by a lot, some by a little. This is the PFAS sludge data. And again, you can see that the median concentration is quite a bit above our screening concentration here in Maine. And this is a breakdown of what percentage of the samples that were taken exceeded and did not exceed the screening concentration. Here, the orange is sludge that exceeded the PFOA screening concentration, and the blue did not. Same for the PFAS data set. You can see PFAS was more of an issue here than the PFOA, in that 90% of the sludge exceeded for PFAS. And then when you say, did it exceed for PFOA and or PFAS, we're all the way up to 94% of materials tested exceeding for one or the other or both. We see the same graphic here for our compost data set. Again, the median for PFOA is above the screening concentration. It's obviously a much smaller data set. We have fewer composting facilities than we do Class B programs. And the PFAS data, you can see that the median and the screening concentration lines come up quite a bit closer, and it is what we saw in the data, that PFOA seemed to be more of the issue in compost rather than the PFAS. And again, the same graphic showing which ones, the percentage of which materials exceeded the screening concentration. And you can see this PFOA pie chart, up to 94% of the compost exceeded for PFOA, where 61% exceeded for PFAS. But when you lump those together, you're all the way down to only 3% of compost not exceeding for either one. So that's obviously a large percentage of the materials produced in Maine. Like I said, PFBS didn't seem to be the issue, so we've kind of turned away from that particular parameter. Something to note here is that no paper mill residuals exceeded for PFOA or PFAS, and those primarily included things like lime grit, lime mud, and precipitated calcium carbonate materials from those paper mills. We don't really see primary or secondary wastewater treatment plant sludge from paper mills being land applied here in Maine. So, we didn't get that data. We don't have the data to look at. And let's talk a little bit about the site-specific soil data we received. You can see here that 15% exceeded for PFOA, 56% for PFAS, and for one or the other, or both, we're up to 58%. However, it's important for me to note that the data here can be a little bit skewed because when facilities began testing their site-specific soils in anticipation of land applying Class B materials, they tested the fields that they were hoping to use that growing season. As that data started rolling in, it became clear that some of these fields that have been used over and over, we were seeing exceedances of the screening concentration, which in this case for soils at a land application site. That is also the sealing concentration. So when we saw that the soils exceeded for PFOA or PFAS or both on the site-specific soils, we did not allow any further land application on those particular sites. So the generators began turning their attention to the fields that they had licensed that had fewer applications and less material land applied there. So they began doing targeted testing, which kind of skews the data. So they started testing fields they were hoping to be able to use, in that they wanted less land app to have been done on those. So that is an important disclaimer to that site-specific soil data. You can see here the average and median and maximum concentrations we saw in each of the different matrices. It's important to see that, for both sludge and compost, we were seeing numbers over our screening concentrations for both the median and average. And the site-specific soil data, as I stated, that was a targeted testing by midway through that effort, so it's a bit skewed. So the median and average obviously were affected by that. But it also is important to note that we did see a concentration of PFAS in the high 30 nanogram per gram range. So back in the spring and summer of 2019, we received the data and we were able to approve for distribution 13 different composts, all 3 of the Class A pellet products that come into Maine for distribution. We were able to approve 7 different Class B programs for land application. However, sadly, there were 3 programs that could not land apply. And this obviously caused serious problems for that particular program. And our Bureau of Water Quality was able to step in with some emergency dewatering grants, as one of those Class B programs was a liquid program, and they had about 1 million gallons of sludge they needed to deal with, as they were not able to land apply on their licensed sites because the site-specific soils were too high. Water quality folks are also working on providing some grants for some dewatering infrastructure as well. We have done a limited septage study here in Maine, and we also received 1 or 2 pieces of data from a treatment plant that did their own sampling. Our sampling effort, we contracted out. We were able to get 7 samples. This was in late fall of 2019. And we did try to take it from different types of facilities in Maine, in that we went to a dewatering facility. We've gone to a septage storage and land app site, and we also got some samples at treatment plants that receive septage. You can see here the average and median concentrations in septage, and later here we see a graphical representation of that. For PFOA, we do continue to see that median above our screening concentration, and we see, obviously, we have 1 sample that's quite a bit higher. I don't know why that is. We haven't done enough investigation to draw any conclusions from that at this point because the data set is small. And we see the PFAS median finally below our screening concentration in septage. So perhaps that is good news. That remains to be seen. Again, the pie chart is showing the percentage of septage that's over for PFOA and PFAS, and or both. So we do continue to see a majority of that material over our screening concentrations for one or both PFOA or PFAS. So the report from the task force was issued in January of 2020. They had a lot of recommendations. for moving forward on this issue. This is not a complete list. I urge you to go to our website at the address here and check out that report. This is a very distilled version. The big ones to hit here are, obviously we want to provide safe drinking water. They'd like to see all community water systems, schools and daycare facilities, and non-transient, non-community water systems tested as well. And some work on private drinking water wells that may be in proximity to residual land application sites that could be impacted. Another important piece here is that they recommended using the EPA health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion, but to include not only PFOA and PFAS, but PFHXS, PFNA, and PFHPA as well. So that diverges a bit from EPA. There was some work going on with this in our legislature, but because of the pandemic, everything was tabled, and perhaps we will see that taken up in the next legislative session. They want to protect food supply, and they do recommend restrictions on agronomic utilization of these residuals that contain PFAS, investigate and remediate any contamination that's found, and expand testing of agricultural produce and products derived, whereas residuals have been used to date. There's been a lot of testing of milk where the dairy cows have eaten hay from the fields or corn, but not much else. Obviously, we want to get to the source and reduce uses of PFAS, including the AFFF foam, and try not to purchase items for state use that contain PFAS. We want to see more investigating of PFAS contamination in the environment, prioritizing, and we're just beginning to do this, prioritizing locations for sampling where residuals have been spread. There's work afoot to amend the Uncontrolled Sites Law to require removal and treatment of PFAS if it's a danger to public health. We'd like to see our CDC, and they are working on this, though a lot of them have been diverted to doing epidemiological work because of the pandemic. But our CDC folks are working on an uptake model for both hay and corn. And we'd like to see toxicity values established that are reliable. We obviously want to see waste and residuals managed responsibly, require regular testing of residuals, which we have undertaken that requirement here at the DEP, and modify the frequency of testing when we're seeing those concentrations diminish over time, which we hope we will as PFAS compounds are phased out and no longer used, or they're, hopefully we find a safer alternative. But we want to see testing make the most sense. It's rather expensive for our licensees, so if we can decrease the frequency, that's good for them. And also to look at different treatment and disposal technologies, perhaps incineration and other technologies that could destroy PFAS compounds. Public education is a big piece, pollution prevention efforts, developing educational materials and training people in different sectors is a big part of that. The task force is recommending more federal action, source reduction, as well as finalizing toxicity values, establishing MCLs, and helping farmers that may have been impacted by PFAS. We'd also like to see some federal research and funding come down the line. And for state actions on our side here in Maine, we're spending a lot of money doing this with no dedicated monies to do so. We'd like to see some of that. It would allow us to expand our testing And we'd like to see some money available to municipalities and drinking water and wastewater facilities, farmers, and businesses. We are currently using the funding and resources available to do what we can, but as I said, we're absorbing this into budgets that weren't designed just for PFAS issues. Perhaps a bond initiative will be down the road, I don't know. And we'd like to be able to see these damage claims apply to responsible parties. So a big piece that we've undertaken already that the PFAS Task Force recommended was ongoing testing for our licensees in the agronomic utilization and composting sector. Licensees were notified back in February that they needed to do this, and it includes folks who have Class B program license approval. A lot of them, as I said before, they don't land apply. They might send it for disposal or composting rather than land apply it. They're required to test once a year. If they're land applying, we want to see increased testing up to twice per year. Composting facilities have to test their finished compost twice per year. And all the sludge feedstocks that go into those composts at least once per year. I'd like to see how the composting process affects these compounds, if at all. Obviously, if they're going to land apply and they haven't tested Class B site soils, they have to do that. They have to perform pollutant loading rate calculations to make sure by land applying their residuals, they will not drive the numbers in the soil up over those screening concentrations, which we talked about. And that has to be done for Class B land app as well as Class A pellets and compost. And the Class A and compost producers have to have an updated best management practice or information sheet that they give to their end user to tell them how to use the materials properly, and also to disclose that there are PFAS compounds in these materials above the screening concentrations in Maine. We want the buyer to beware. Moving forward, we are currently working on a corn uptake study. We are reviewing and validating that data as we speak. Again, we've had some resources diverted over at our CDC to deal with the pandemic, but we are working on that corn uptake model. We are currently working on a limited groundwater study at current and former land app sites for Class B sludge materials. We're still identifying sites, but we have begun taking some samples at different facilities that already have groundwater monitoring wells available to us. So that work is beginning, and the reason we want to do that is to see whether the model that was used to develop our screening concentrations is appropriate. Is that leaching to groundwater number the correct one? All this obviously hinges on money, and we are obviously in the midst of an economic downturn, which could impact budgets, state budgets as well as federal, related to the COVID-19 crisis. So it may affect what we can do going forward. And with that, I will end.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Carla. A bunch of questions have come in. They sort of center around 3 topics. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to all of them because we just want to take a few questions now and then get to our next presentation. But one topic is sort of sampling method and analysis. So were they just grab samples? Are they composite samples? Was the incremental sampling method, the more formal methodology used? And then also what sort of lab analysis was performed? Do you know?
It's a modified 537 isotope dilution method. The sampling varied. I think some of the sludge samples, because of the way the materials were coming off, like for instance, a press, those may have been grab samples. The site-specific soil samples and the compost samples were composite samples.
Okay, great. Another set of questions is around those screening levels and how they were developed, and are they also used for soil or just for sludge, and, you know, sort of more about how and what
Sure.
the screening levels are.
Sure. So I hesitate to get too deeply into this because I'm not a hydrogeologist and I did not work on the modeling that went into developing these screening concentrations. But it's my understanding that the sea soil model was used. There has been some controversy about that from our regulated community. I'll disclose that immediately and upfront. They are recommending we use a PRISM model. We are evaluating that, but those screening concentrations were developed using a sea soil model, modeling program, and it was based on leaching to groundwater, and that, again, modeling, with an endpoint in the groundwater of 200 parts per trillion. So it is not 70 parts per trillion. The endpoint was 200 parts per trillion. So that's how that was developed. If you want further information on that, I can point you to a response to comment document that was published as part of that rulemaking.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can include that on the NMO website where we post the slides, maybe, or a link to more information about what's going on in Maine. And then the third sort of group of questions around sources. So is there any generalizations about, you know, certain POTWs having problems with the biosolids versus not, you know, with what the sources of their inputs are, and same with the septage and the compost folks. So is there any general?
Yeah, there's not much I can say about that other than, you know, we did see, you know, we did see a higher concentration in compost from residential dewatered septage. That was the highest numbers I saw in compost, which surprised me. Obviously, when you compost, you are reducing the volume, you know, so you're concentrating things down anyway. And when you're pumping a septic tank, obviously you're pumping out the solids, so that's already concentrated, and then you dewater it, you're further concentrating it, and then you compost it, it's again further concentrating. So I was surprised by the numbers I saw there. So that is the only conclusion I feel comfortable drawing. We saw different levels at different treatment plants. Some of them are very small, no industrial inputs to speak of, and you'd see the same the levels in the sludge at those treatment plants as you might in, say, a Portland, which is our largest city and does have more of an industrial sector. So I don't think I can draw any conclusions from that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That goes through most of these questions that we've gotten in. If we have some time at the end, there's a few more, you know, specific ones on different tangents. But I think we should probably move on. So thank you so much, Carla. I'm going to switch over control to Eamon Tuig, who is from the Department of Environmental Conservation in Vermont. He joined them in 2012, and since 2017, he, oh, are we good? Yeah. Oh. Okay, since 2017, he is the manager of the Residuals, Waste, and Emerging Contaminants Program in the Waste Management and Prevention Division at the Vermont DEC. So chief among his duties of the program is ensuring that the beneficial reuse of residual materials, such as biosolids, is performed in a manner that protects the environment and human Prior to working for the state of Vermont, he conducted research at the University of Vermont on nutrient loading and pathogen loading to surface and groundwaters. And he has his bachelor's from Vassar College and his master's in plant and soil science from the University of Vermont. So with that, I will turn it over to Eamon.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can you just confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Yeah, you're a little bit tinny, but everybody needs to just bear with us with everybody working from home. We're doing the best we can with the audio. So go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in this country. And I'm in Vermont right now, where it is about 90 degrees in May, which is unheard of, and it's 80 some degrees in my house, so hopefully I don't pass out from heat exhaustion. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about some of Vermont's efforts over the last year and a half, looking at PFAS in how it relates to residual materials and wastewater. This is a picture of some Class B biosolids that have been dried and stored for over, I think, a year, and they've been mixed, as Carla had indicated previously. One of the ways to achieve Class B biosolids is through addition of lime to stabilize the product. So this is a lime stabilized Class B dry product that's being prepared for spreading. I'd like to just thank the following folks who contributed to all of this work, in particular my colleagues Josh, John, and Casey at Vermont DEC. And we're going to be sharing some information that we obtained through consultant contracting and help at Weston & Sampson and ATC. There's also a lot of Vermont wastewater treatment facility operators, municipal managers who were involved in facilitating this work. Also our septage haulers in Vermont. So just a quick shout out to them. So Vermont's story with PFAS really begins in 2016. In 2016, it was brought to the state's attention that PFAS compounds were used at a manufacturing facility called ChemFab in Bennington, and this facility was in operation for many decades. There's a picture on the left here of some of the process in which materials were coated with Teflon, in this case principally PFOA, which is one of the myriad of PFAS chemicals, an 8-chain compound that was very commonly used. On the right there is a picture of the Denver airport. So the pavilions in the background there were made at the ChemFab facility. This is an aerial picture of the Bennington area, and just a general indication of what was done in the area in response to the discovery of PFOA there. We have sampled over 700 private wells. Over 60% of those had a PFOA detection, and over 50% of those wells had a PFOA concentration above 20 parts per trillion. I'll get a little bit more into that in a couple slides when we talk about Vermont's regulatory standards. We have installed point of entry treatment systems at many homes, and also extended 2 water supply lines to some 400 homes. That number might have gone up since I made this slide. Generally on this map, if you can read the legend, blue dots are non-detects, and red dots are over 1,000 per trillion, and orange is 100 to 1,000, yellow is 20 to 100. So you can see there's quite a few wells there with contamination. Fortunately, pretty much everybody in this town that wants to drink clean water is now drinking clean water. This is a quick chart showing where Vermont is on its standards for PFAS. On the left there is a list of 5 PFAS compounds and their carbon links. So I will refer to those throughout the rest of the presentation as the Vermont 5 when we're looking at data, because those are the ones we have regulatory standards for. So we're often looking at those 5, and it is any combination or the sum of those. Vermont adopted a health advisory, I believe that was in 2018 for those 5 compounds, and it is currently now an MCL as of, I believe, March 2020, an MCL being a maximum contaminant level. We also have adopted the standards into our groundwater enforcement, and that has been adopted into our groundwater protection rule and strategy, and also our investigated sites remediation rule, or our I rule. We also have a residential soil, I guess it's a screening level, and this is for incidental inhalation or human health standard. It is not a soil leaching standard. This is more for site cleanup. And we also developed some guidance because there was some concerns about landfill leachate containing PFAS going to wastewater treatment facilities, and whether or not our wastewater treatment facilities should be concerned about those concentrations. And so these are our recommended levels for facilities to accept landfill leachate. These are based on a in-stream waste concentration result expected from leachate going in at a certain gallon, not being treated in the wastewater plant, and being basically discharged as it came in with the same concentration. So it's based roughly on a fish tissue consumption advisory. I believe it's Michigan's 12 part per trillion for PFOS, and I forget what the recommended in-stream waste concentration is for PFOA. But the good news is that the landfill leachate that we've tested so far has not risen to those levels. And we will talk a little bit more about landfill leachate because we did some additional testing. In 2019, I went back up. In 2018, Vermont undertook a collaborative effort with the University of Vermont and Sanborn and Head to look at PFAS in soils around the state. This is what many people refer to as a background soil study. So we collected, or I should say UVM collected 66 samples. These are shallow soil samples from village, parks, greens, places where we do not expect to find any sort of inputs of PFAS from an industrial source or a point or local source. They were analyzed for 17 PFAS by the University of Vermont. So these did not go to a private laboratory, although there was some split sampling and unchecking on with a commercial laboratory. Generally, what you're seeing there on the left is a map of Vermont, and I know for those not in the Northeast, it's a little bit difficult to make out, but this is the Canadian border up here. This is Lake Champlain, so this is New York on this side. This is Lake Champlain, which is the western border of Vermont, and this is the southern border of Vermont, this being the eastern border of Vermont with New Hampshire. So what we're seeing here is generally places with higher populations are correlating with higher levels of PFAS in soils, in background soils. So this area here is the Burlington area, Chittenden County area, which is where the majority of Vermont's population lives. And down here is the White River Junction area, where there's also a populous center. So circles of yellow color are the highest values that we saw, and green is between 2 and 5 nanogram per kilogram. And I apologize for those who aren't up on the units. Nanogram per kilogram is parts per billion. So when we were talking about these standards here, these are part per trillion. Typically when we talk about PFAS standards and results in water, it's usually in the part per trillion range. And when you talk about PFAS in things like soils or residual materials, those can be typically in the part per billion range. On the right here is a graph, and this is just a summary table showing a select group of PFAS. We did analyze for more of these. The highlighted ones are the Vermont 5. And again, these are backgrounds. These are average over the 66 sample data set. All of these samples came back with PFAS in them. There wasn't a single sample that did not contain PFAS. And you'll see, I'd like to draw your attention here to PFOS, which is the predominant compound that we see in soils when it comes to PFAS. And that's right around 1 part per billion. So when you sum up just the Vermont 5, we're talking about 2 part per billion at background levels. This report is available on our website if you'd like to dig in much deeper. There's lots of data in there. This brings me to 2019. Vermont and Weston and Sampson collaborated on a project to look at PFAS and landfill leachate, wastewater treatment facility, influent, their discharges, and the solids generated by the wastewater treatment facilities, whether those be sludges or biosolids, and a couple of industrial discharges and a couple of paper sludges. These were all samples analyzed, as Carla had noted earlier, by modified 537. And that's still, I believe, a 24 PFAS compound analysis, although they're, I believe, adding more. And we did about 400 samples. This was a pretty big effort for Vermont. And again, I want to just give a shout out to all the treatment plants who had to endure all this testing, and a big shout out to Weston and Sampson for doing this work and coordinating it all. So I'm going to show you some of the results. I'm going to go through a couple of histograms, and we'll break it up with I'm going to do a little bit of an explanation of what these materials are. So what we're looking at here is, again, we're talking about wastewater treatment facility influent and effluent. So that's water. So we're in nanogram per liter or part per trillion. And black bars indicating influent concentrations, gray bars are indicating effluent. These are various treatment plants that were sampled across Vermont of different sizes. And there are a few that will jump out. Montpelier facility does accept landfill leachate. Bennington is where we had our ChemFab facility and PFOA contamination throughout the town. Newport is another facility that was taking landfill leachate. And Swanton, although they did not take landfill leachate, has some potential industrial inputs. So it is interesting to line these up and look for high values, and as we move forward with how to address these PFAS in all these waste streams. What I've done here is I've overlaid a PFAS signature. So these are all the 24 PFAS compounds on the x-axis that we sampled for. Again, we have concentration in nanogram per liter on the y-axis. And this is influent, effluent at wastewater treatment facility concentrations. And over here on the right is landfill leachate concentration. So they're obviously higher. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these signatures do somewhat match up. So when the facility takes leachate, we may be able to see that a similar signature in their influent and effluent. So I just want to step aside really quick, and I appreciate that Carla went into a discussion of what these materials mean. Oftentimes people like myself and Carla and others who work in this field tend to assume that people who are or who we're presenting to are knowledgeable about what these materials are, but just really for a quick real review here, Vermont and Maine and many states follow the federal Part 503 rules when it comes to a Class A or a Class B biosolid. They're often referred to when it comes to Class A as it's subjected to a process to further reduce pathogens, or PFRP, versus Class B, which is significantly reduced. So as Carla said, there's more pathogens in a Class B material. They all have a vector attraction reduction requirement, which can be met in a variety of ways, from lime stabilization to incorporation into the soil. In Vermont, we require all of these materials to be tested for metals, the 10 regulated metals and PCBs. In Vermont and generally across the nation, if you make a Class A biosolid and you distribute that material once it leaves your facility, it's essentially unregulated, versus Class B, where in Vermont, you must have a very specific site permit with operating parameters and conditions in order to land apply that material. I'd also like to note that Septage is managed by our program, and that is handled pretty much identically to Class B biosolids. It's always lime stabilized, should be screened, it's land applied under economic rates. And obviously in Vermont, we don't allow land application of sludge. Typically, that sludge is being managed straight to the landfill. And I've just got some pictures here at the top. This is a composted Class A biosolid from Springfield, Vermont, in storage. This is the dried Class B product on the first slide of the presentation in Swanton. And just here's an example of just a sludge drying bed, what sludge looks like after sitting in a drying bed for a year or so, going through a freeze-thaw cycle in Vermont, which tends to break the volume down considerably. And generally in Vermont, and pretty much throughout the country, biosolids are at about a 50% reuse rate. So this figure likely somewhat mimics what's going on nationally. We have had a little bit of an upturn in Vermont in our recycling rate for sludge. A lot of that has occurred due to certain agreements being brokered with solid waste districts, and in this case, materials managers like Casella, who will contract to take a large amount of Vermont's sludge from our more populated areas and treat them in a facility to create Class A biosolids. And Vermont has a very high rate of septage per capita. It's at 55% of the population, which I believe is the highest rate in the country. Roughly about 85% of our septage goes directly to wastewater plants, and about 15 to 16% of it is directly land applied after lime stabilization and screening. And here's a quick picture of just a septage hauler truck connecting to a manure truck for spreading. So I wanted to just do a quick overview of what the solids are before we talk about them. This data also came out of that Weston and Sampson and Vermont DEC project where we looked at PFAS and wastewater plant. And on the left here, we have the PFAS concentration. And please note again, this is now in part per billion, not part per trillion. So we're 1,000-fold more concentrated. All the gray bars are a summary of the Vermont 5 PFAS, which I spoke about earlier. And the black bars are the total PFAS for the 24 compounds that we were able to analyze for. These red bars indicate the averages for the two, this lower bar being the average for the Vermont 5 at around 23 to 25 part per billion. And this is the average of the total PFAS across materials, around 80 part per billion. I'd say that's one of the take-home messages here is that looking at the Vermont 5 by themselves is not always telling the complete story. So I guess it's good to have the 24 compounds now analyzed. This is just a further breakout of all of those samples by material type. Again, we've got concentration here on the left, and I apologize, the unit's not there, it's in part per billion. And these are again, gray bar being Vermont 5, black bar being total PFAS, and our 4 different types of material being raw sludge, Class B, Class A biosolids, and this is short paper fiber. I believe that's only 2 samples though. And these are just, again, these pictures earlier that we saw, this being Class A, Class B, and sludge. I thought for some of the people on the call, it might be interesting to actually see what land application tends to look like. I don't know if this will play, but that is essentially a 9,000 gallon manure spreader that contains Class B liquid biosolids, and it is being subsurface injected here into this farm field. This looks like a fall application. And I'm not sure why I can't get it to play, but technical difficulties is what it is. So I will keep moving on. I guess my point being that biosolids land application doesn't look much different from manure spreading in Vermont, at least. Oh, there we go. So not very exciting, but if you haven't seen a biosolids land application in process, that's what it looks like. This treatment facility is right down the road from this field. The farmer is able to drive this tractor and hauler to the wastewater treatment facility to load there and drive back down the road and spread. It's a very efficient operation and likely has a very good carbon footprint in terms of managing this material. Okay, enough with the videos. Go back to some data. By now, I think everyone's getting used to seeing concentration on the left here. These are all the facilities again, and this is just a comparison of the Vermont 5 PFAS in samples of wastewater treatment facility influent, effluent, and the solids. So in some cases, we do have some similarities, but in many cases, we'll find that there may not be much in the solids, and there may be quite a bit in the effluent or vice versa. This is a paper mill here, and it's very interesting. If you look at the solids, there does not appear to be much PFAS there. The effluent is telling a slightly different story. This is another paper processing facility. Similarly, if we look at this wastewater treatment facility, they've got pretty low influent and effluent in their PFAS relatively, but one of the higher values we saw in their solids. So I guess it can be critical to look at all three of these when you're looking at tracking PFAS in wastewater systems. I'd like to make this just real quick point, which was during this project, we learned sort of a valuable lesson about sampling for residual materials. As some of you may have picked up already, some of these residual materials are 1% solids, essentially liquids, and others are much drier, upwards of 80% solids. So depending on how you sample those, the analysis can go very differently, and you can see dramatically different results. This is the same facility's material sampled prior to dewatering and I believe post dewatering. The solid post dewatering is in black and the liquid analysis is in blue or gray. So just very different signatures, which I guess makes sense, but it made for comparing data difficulty. So we were really only able to compare across facilities if the sample was conducted on similar type in terms of solids versus liquids. So based on the sampling we conducted at the wastewater facilities and what we saw in biosolids, we thought it was a appropriate next step to look at actual land application sites. So at the end of that summer, in August to October of 2019, we got together and we selected 4 land application sites that received Class B biosolids or septage. And we worked with a consultant, ATC, on a plan to sample groundwater and soils at those sites. Now, fortunately, or well, I guess it is what it is, all of our permitted land application sites have groundwater wells already installed, up gradient and down gradient. So the good news was that we didn't have to install any wells, and we were able to do some low flow sampling of groundwater at those monitoring wells, and we took soil cores across the fields at 2 depths to be able to compare depths. We also thought it was a good idea to look at any drinking water supplies that were within a 1/4 mile radius of these sites. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of what we saw. This is a Class B biosolids site. It's broadcast applied biennially since about 2010, so it's roughly 20 years. Every other year it gets land applied. It's a dried Class B biosolid, and the map on the left shows all the groundwater results that we obtained, and the map on the right shows the soil results. So ND indicates non-detected. So basically this site has not really been impacted by land application, at least in terms of PFAS. These blue dots here indicate groundwater wells. Generally the flow is from left to right in terms of groundwater. But really we have no detects in groundwater. And again, these are Vermont 5 and the total. So these would be 5 compounds and this would be 24 compounds analyzed. We also looked at, I believe 6 to 7 residences that were, scattered around the outside of the field and checked their water supplies and found no impacts from PFAS and from land application. And this site, this residence here is, very close to the field. In fact, the land application has to be, because of our setback requirements, they have to flag off a portion of this field and not apply there. These are results from soil testing, everywhere from basically non-detect to very low part per billion numbers. And these are, I would argue, as low, if not lower, than our background study numbers we came up with the prior year. Granted, they were tested at a different lab, but it is interesting. And the S stands for shallow and the D for deep. So these are our 0 to 6 number, and below, at 2 feet is the depth, the deeper sample there. Again, we've got part per trillion, part per billion. Keep that in mind as we go throughout these. I'm going to skip the other 2 sites that we did because they were kind of middle of the road sites, but this site became quite interesting right off the bat. This site has received quite an interesting mix of materials over the years, and it's a multi-decade site. And in fact, we're not even sure how far back the applications began, but the general consensus is that it's likely around 40 years of land application. And this site received a mix of primarily stabilized septage, and it also received Class B biosolids from a local wastewater treatment facility. All of the material was lime stabilized prior to spreading, and it was all incorporated immediately upon spreading because they're in a floodplain and in a non-annual crop, or I'm sorry, in annual crop. So the groundwater results here are on the left, and the soil results are on the right. Again, we've got the Vermont 5 and the total PFAS of 24 PFAS compounds. And we also tested 3 to 4 residences, water supplies, residential water supplies around the field. We do have impacts to groundwater, as you will see there in those boxes. Keep in mind that our Vermont groundwater standard is 20 part per trillion. Some good news from this site is that none of these water supplies were affected. Groundwater flow is generally down on this site towards the river, which kind of goes out of the screen down here. And this is Interstate 89, so generally the groundwater will have to flow beneath the highway across here to make it to the river. These are the soil results we have. Anywhere from our deeper samples, we're showing lower numbers, some cases non-detect, but we do have soil values in upwards of 50 part per billion at this location. So this data was collected in the fall of 2019, and ultimately what we ended up doing was doing some confirmatory sampling at this site. And this is the same site, just a little different looking map here. We did not retest the upgradient wells, which are up here, these 3, because they were non-detect and because we had no impacts to these water supplies up here. We did retest and confirm, do some confirmatory sampling in December of 2019, and essentially confirmed what we found in the original sampling. There was not a huge change in the numbers. And as part of that work, based on our groundwater protection rule strategy, we started to look at, we needed to check our compliance points. And according to our groundwater rule, the compliance point is not necessarily the edge of the field, it's 300 feet from the property boundary. And this permittee owns this property here. So 3 wells were, either 2 of these were installed, 1 was existing. And we sampled those wells, and the results you can see there, I hope. This well was non-detected, this well was non-detected, but this well was at 214 part per trillion, and this is for the Vermont 5, I should have said earlier. So only 5 compounds listed here. And because we have exceedances of the groundwater standard here at this compliance point, possibly this one could be considered as a compliance point with surface water here. Land applications on hold at this site. We're currently developing a long-term monitoring plan with the permittee. So based on those 4 sites that we looked at, we felt it was important to look at land application sites across the board. So in December of 2019, actually in November of 2019, we reached out to all of our land application permittees and asked them to hire a consultant and conduct sampling for groundwater and down gradient well groundwater and soils, and to do a composite soil sample at their sites. That data has been coming in and is essentially all in. And what I'm showing here is the average soil or the composite soil results for all the land app sites that we've tested so far. Again, gray being Vermont 5, black being total. And so we've got quite a range of data here. This was the site here that I showed the map of earlier where there was little impact. These are the 3 sites that were on the Septage land application site that was impacted. And we've got everything in between, including some rather high numbers. But I would like to note that we did, as part of this work, we did some additional background soil checking at our state. The state owns some agricultural properties around the state, so we were able to sample those as well to get just to confirm our background numbers. And here's just a quick comparison to circle back. This is that same chart. We've got our soil values for PFAS, and they're averaging roughly for the Vermont 5 across the board at about 10 part per billion, maybe 11. When we compare that to our background study for the Vermont 5 at 2, I think at this point we could say that you know, the majority of these sites are elevated relative to and PFAS of these sites is elevated relative to background numbers. I don't think that's a surprise. We do have a lot of groundwater data that's coming in. We're still in the process of organizing all that data and trying to determine what it means and working with those permittees in locations where we do have exceedances. I would last just like to point you all to our website, which everyone does. We have quite a few documents on our website. If you just type in Vermont DEC and PFAS, you'll get to a few different web pages that contain reports. We've had an annual report that's come out the last few years that contains information about a lot of projects that I wasn't able to get in today, and there's information in particular there on our public drinking water supply testing, which was completed, and some other studies that have gone on at specific industrial sites, and our future plans for our future work. And with that, I guess I will turn it back over to Jennifer.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Eamon. That was very interesting. There are definitely some questions coming in. Let's see here. I'm wondering, one of the slides you showed had sort of Class A, Class B, and Septage. Anyway, it looked like levels were higher in the Class A biosolids, and those, I guess, you don't know where they're going or how they're being used. Is that correct? So what it looks like there's, you know, we know Class B, that's the land application sites, but what about Class A? Yeah, there you go.
Well, I would generally say that, as I said previously, that Class A material, once it's generated and distributed, whether that be given away or sold in Vermont, I'm not aware of anyone selling Class A biosolids from their facility, but they are distributed. That is correct. They are no longer tracked at that point. That might be changing in the future here as we work through various responses to PFAS and residuals. A lot of this is in development. We have solid waste rules that are currently in draft and making their way through the approval processes, and there'll be some changes in those rules. And we're likely to see some additional monitoring and permits, but generally that's correct. I don't know if it's fair to say that based on the data set that we have, that Class A is always going to be higher. This might be a unique stat to Vermont. I don't know what the specific reasons are. I know there has been some preliminary thought that potentially a higher heat process might drive some of the PFAS precursors to terminal ends that we're measuring, terminal PFAS groups that we're measuring. Obviously, if you're making a Class A product and you're destroying pathogens, typically you're doing that by exposing it to a higher temperature versus a Class B. That's one theory, I believe, or not, our hypothesis, I should say. It could also be, as Carla mentioned, the nature of the municipality. I think Class A products probably tend to be produced in larger municipalities. And we've already saw in that background study in Vermont that PFAS and background PFAS in soil was likely correlated with population density.
Okay. Let's see. Someone noted that in some of the results, the effluent concentration was higher than the influent concentration. So are there thoughts about that?
That's absolutely true. I think you would find that probably in the case of many facilities. Why that is, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's a general rule of thumb that PFAS is really certainly not destroyed in the wastewater treatment facility process. It's possible that some, and likely that some compounds are again being transformed. I believe there's some work going on in New Hampshire looking at PFAS across the wastewater treatment facility process. I think that's probably the only way to answer that question. You know, and keep in mind these are grab samples, which is probably also a factor. You know, it depends on hydraulic residence time or PFAS residence time in the facility. You know, whether it's coming in absolutely consistently in terms of concentration, whether there's spikes as different users come online or different processes in the town are going on.
Okay. So here's another one about wastewater treatment plant sludge is also disposed at landfills. So, you know, there's that cycle of, you know, going to landfills and then the leachate going to the POTW. So are there thoughts about management of this material at landfills?
Are there thoughts? Absolutely. Is there a solution that Vermont has? No, not yet. There has been some work. Vermont has done some work on that. I believe there was one of the operators of the landfill has tested material that came in to that landfill for PFAS, and I believe there's an upcoming webinar by Casey Cathan from Vermont DEC, and I think I'll maybe set up that presentation with some suspense and say, tune into that one if you want some answers on landfill leachate. It's not really something that, this project really just looked at concentrations. It didn't really look at solutions.
Okay, yes, that will be a June 10th webinar. So let's see, about soil and levels in soil, there's are there interesting trends with the different types of soil and the depth of the samples taken? Was there anything about soil type that you looked at?
That's a good question. I would say there's a couple of consistencies in soil that we saw. One is that PFOS is the dominant compound, typically also in residual materials. PFOS is sticky. It sticks to either organic matter or something, but although it's maybe considered a legacy PFAS compound because both PFOA and PFOS were voluntarily phased out of production, that doesn't mean they're not still entering these waste systems on legacy consumer products or coming in on products that are produced here in the US. But we see PFOS dominating across the board in our background soils and in our land app sites. In some cases, we might just see PFOS. We certainly see more of the compounds that we're measuring for in shallow soils. It does seem to be that the more, at least with the limited data we have, that the greater the depth, the less concentrations of PFAS we're seeing. And I would imagine if someone did a soil profile, you'd see different PFAS compounds depending on their length. And I believe there are some studies out there on that, so I'm not as familiar with those, but I do believe that work is ongoing. In terms of soil type, we're not able to answer that question at this time, but I am aware of some work being done on that, looking at at sandy soils versus clay soils, and I believe one of the trends that was seen is that PFAS likes to fit in those pockets and spaces between the air and water interface, so that there might be, which might mean a sandier soil could have more PFAS, but I can't confirm that.
Okay. Then there's a question, you might have answered this on a later slide, but a lot of times the levels of the Vermont 5, then there was the total number, the 24 that you were analyzing for, and there was maybe a big difference. Are there any of the compounds that are not in the Vermont 5 that sort of stand out as being the problem compounds in the bigger list?
That's a good question. I think it's possible that, I don't know if I would consider them a problem or not, but I mean, I think we have, because I don't know if that information is available, but we certainly have, I'm just going to pull up one slide here. We certainly see PFBS in some of our samples, although I'm not seeing it here. And I'm trying to think if there's any other that jump out. For example, here's PFBS. And that's a 4-chain carbon. I think some of the hexylsulfonates tend to show up as well, and we regulate for one of those. So
okay.
Sorry, I can't answer that question better, but yes, there are compounds outside of Vermont 5 that show up. Certainly, the fact that we're testing for 24, but we hear every other month that there's now thousands and thousands more potential PFAS compounds. So, the analytical techniques are catching up. Okay,
I have one specific question for Eamon, and then we'll end on a more general question for everybody. So with that site that was right by Interstate 89 that you outlined, was there possible contributions from the highway and sources, just from auto traffic and other aspects that might have led to some of those higher levels?
That's a good question. It was a question we asked, for example, when you look at, triple F response, triple F being firefighting foam, at airports, certainly there are hot spots at airports that you can, find from releases. This is a stretch of highway known for its weather and for accidents, but I think we're relatively confident that the data we're seeing here is from land application. We are continuing to work with the consultant and permittee on this, and I'm still, I believe the consultant's report, the final report, is due to us very shortly here, so we'll have another chance to talk about that. But we are attributing the PFAS at this site at this time to land application.
Okay, and then the last question, that's a more general question, and Carla can jump on this one as well, which is just education and outreach to these farmers that do take the biosolids applications, and just letting them know of this issue, and just sort of what educational efforts might be ongoing.
That's a really good question, and I did neglect to mention that part of our work with doing sampling at the land application site was done in coordination with our Agency of Agriculture. So we would meet with the landowners either together, the two agencies working together, or sometimes individually. All that work is still going on. I don't want to speak for the Agency of Agriculture in Vermont, but I know that they are engaging farmers, and I agree that it's important for the farmers to have as much information as they can so they can make the decision. They can make a decision what's best for them. And yeah, I'll leave it at that if Carla wants to chime in.
Yeah, I would just echo what Eamon said. We are working closely with our Department of Agriculture, especially going forward in identifying sites where we think we should put our efforts first. And we'll be working closely with the farmers and our Department of Ag on that.
All right. Well, thank you to both Carla and Eamon for this webinar. We really appreciate that. We've got 4 more coming up in this series. The next one is about focusing a little more on fate and transport and the cycling through the environment of PFAS and sources and how you can expect them to move around, and then looking at more specifically modeling, and we talked about that a little bit today with the screening levels and that, but looking at different models and which ones might be the most appropriate to be using. So that's the next one. That is next Thursday, next week, on the 4th. So with that, I think we'll sign off. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending today.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Carla.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.